I'm Stacie Goddard. I'm professor of political science here at Wellesley College. She, her, hers pronouns. My specialty here is international relations with a specific focus on international security, which means that I teach the classes that look at the causes of war and peace, as well as the conduct of war, and I also teach some specialty classes on technology and warfare, nuclear politics, and the rise and fall of great powers. Which means that, of course, when I came in to think about the particular theme for this winter session, I decided to do something totally out of my wheelhouse and show something on the issue of women's issues in global affairs. So again, not entirely out of my wheelhouse that I'll talk about, but you know, there is definitely part of me. It's like, hey, can we do the nuclear politics? No, I'm not going to do that. Not this time. And I do want to give you a bit of a background on this thing today, and that's really going to be the focus of what I'm talking about today, just so you kind of get your footing here before we have all of these speakers coming in that are generally oriented, as I'll go into later, either the particular substance of the theme. Some of them were actually delegates to the conference, but also one thing that I want to stress about this is all of this is meant to be forward-thinking. We're looking at a conference that was held 25 years ago in the year of its anniversary, but the point isn't to put ourselves back there. The point is to use this as a lens to kind of push ourselves forward, right? And as a matter of fact, this is kind of the strange thing that I want to say about the theme. The theme is in some ways important. It's what orients this institute. I want to give you some background, but in other ways, the theme is absolutely not important, right? Honestly, you could go through this institute without doing a Google search on the Fourth World Conference on Women. I mean, it wouldn't be bad if you did that, but you could do that and you'd be perfectly fine. Right? And I even had a moment like, should I do something? Should I actually assign them, for example, the platform for action that came out of this? But as you all now know from yesterday, reading UN resolutions is like some form of torture. Like, you're resolved, you're condemning, you're committed, great, right? That's basically what this is, right? So what I want to do today is, yes, give you some of the background of the substance, but really more importantly, give you an idea of how we're going to use this particular theme as a lens to think about the core issues involved in being in the Albright Institute more generally, right? And here, just kind of give you the framework of this before I go into the theme. Really, there are kind of three core issues and three reasons that we chose this to be the theme this year. And I'll go through these in turn. The first of which is it gives us a way to think about leadership and global affairs, and in particular to think about different ways in which actors practice leadership and affect change in global affairs. Right? Second of all, it gives us an idea of the difficulties involved in addressing global challenges. Okay. Now, obviously, this is something that you talked about with Liz yesterday in her discussion of complexity, and I want to unpack that more here. Right, in terms of what the type of global challenges were involved in this particular conference. Right? And finally, I think that it's also a useful theme to think about the importance of multi-disciplinary approaches to global affairs, the importance of having multiple sets of expertise at the bargaining table. Right? So in some ways, this is a really useful theme to walk through each of these types of foundational principles that are so important to the Albright Institute. Now, with that in mind, there we go. So up here, and by the way, if you're interested right now in Pendleton, we actually have the copy of Secretary Albright's poster. This was the official poster from the 1995 conference, and she has one that is signed that's hanging in Pendleton. And the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of leadership and thinking about this conference through the lens of leadership. One of the reasons that this was kind of a really resonant topic for us was the Secretary's own role in the Fourth World Conference on Women. And I'll go through some of the details of that conference. Obviously, you can see vaguely from the poster, this was held in September 1995 over a period of 11 days. And it brought together both representatives from governance as well as representatives from the non-governmental organizational community to talk about a broad array of women's issues in global affairs. Okay. So actually, when we're talking about the Beijing conference, we're talking about two different conferences that went on. one of which was in Beijing proper. It had about 17,000 people attending. 6,000 of those were representing their individual countries, so there are 189 countries represented. And their goal was to come up with a platform of action. Not that different than what you were attempting to do yesterday. This was a series of resolutions that would be an impetus, a charge, if you will, to governance on how they could advance women's equality in global affairs. Okay. So that was the goal of the United Nations Conference. So that was official. It was intergovernmental. Right? It had to be called through a vote, the United Nations General Assembly. That's the main and fully representative body of the United Nations. Yesterday, you're the United Nations Security Council, as you found out there, a little smaller, right? So this is all of the countries equally represented, right? So the charge had to come from the United States General Assembly. Support had to come from individual nations, right? So support in terms of actually sending delegates, support in terms of actually funding the conference, all of that had to come from the individual countries. And the delegations themselves were representatives of the government. So the United States delegation was headed by then UN Ambassador Madeleine Albright. And it was also attended, and at the time this was actually pretty controversial, by First Lady Hillary Clinton. So another Wellesley graduate you may have heard of. And when I say it was controversial, and we'll talk about this, I think, when we're on the panel today, is that there was an ongoing debate, and had been going on ever since President Clinton had gotten into office, about what the role should be of a First Lady. Right? And there had been ongoing criticisms, in particular, that Hillary Clinton was far too politically involved as a First Lady, whether or not that was on issues of healthcare or whether or not it was here on issues of global women's rights. The question was, what is a First Lady of a state doing as part of a delegation? Right? And as it turns out, she ended up doing quite a bit. Right? So here we have this conference that was attended by two very notable United States leaders, as well as leaders throughout the world, in terms of the delegations, as well as leaders of a different sort. And these were the leaders and activists of the non-governmental organizations. Now, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, the non-governmental organizations, their conference was off-site, and purposefully so. It was located about an hour and a half from the center of Beijing. This conference had 30,000 attendees, representative non-governmental organizations across the globe, right? So these organizations were not official representatives of their government, right? This in many ways was representative of the vibrant civil society that had grown up well before 1995 around issues of women's rights. Right? And the goal here was not to produce some sort of consensus, right? The goal here was to bring together this eclectic array of non-governmental organizations, right? And when I say eclectic array, I mean anything from the National Organization of Women, on the one hand, being in the same room as NGOs that were representing the Catholic Church on issues of women's rights. Yeah, you can imagine what those conversations looked like, but they were ongoing, and they were meant to bring these groups together to see how they could, first of all, think together about issues of women's rights, but then also to think about how they, as non-governmental representatives, could influence the platform for action that was being developed in Beijing proper. Right? So we have these different modes of conferences that are going on in this moment in September 1995. Okay? And I think that looking at this conference is useful, and looking at the issues of the conference is useful, as I said, is because it does shed light on these types of fundamental things we want to talk about at the Albright Institute. Right? And the first of which I mentioned is this idea of thinking about different modes of leadership. Different modes of leadership. Okay. Now, look, I even started here myself. When we think about modes of leadership, we kind of immediately go to the official, positional authorities, right? In this case, two key members of the United States delegation, again, Secretary Albright and Secretary Clinton. This is a conversation that the two secretaries actually had this year at their respective Wellesley reunions. And they talked each about their role at Beijing, right? And obviously these are two types of standouts, right? But I'm sure you've already begun to have this discussion, right? Is this necessarily where you want your focus on leadership to be? I want to take a moment and actually ask you, when you think about what leadership is, how would you begin to define it? And I'm going to throw that out there. I'm going to give you a moment to think while I say, and I have my bit of confessional moment. It's really sometimes strange for me to think about that I'm in an institute, that I'm thinking about teaching leadership, where I would say up to a few years ago, I hated talking about leadership. I hated it. Because I'm somebody who works, obviously, in political science. I'm really historically inclined in a lot of my own research. And it felt like anytime I read something on literature, on leadership, it was something about this one very special man. He was so special. You know, he changed international affairs all by himself, right? It's the type of what we used to call great man history, right? You'd focus there, and that's all I could think about when I came to leadership. And then eventually my views changed about the importance of talking about and teaching leadership, right? Because I at least began to realize that we could have different definitions, and that maybe part of what we could do collectively here is not just simply say, well, we're going to do leadership and now we're back to great man theory, but actually begin to think about how we can define it and own it for ourselves. So when I say leadership as being here, one way to think about what leadership is during this institute, what do you want to learn about? What do you think it is?
Yeah. So when I think of leadership, what comes to mind is like mobilizing, whether like yourself or like others towards like a common goal, whether it's your goal or like the group's goal.
Right, right. So there's something in here about mobilization, right? There's something in here about the importance of collective action, right? Why is that problematic? Collective action, okay, that seems relatively straightforward. I mean, you have a goal. We have a shared goal, so we work together to achieve it. Why do I need leadership for that? Yeah.
Because like we discovered yesterday, even though it seems on the surface like we have the same goal, it might be difficult for people to like actually come together to do those things. Because everyone might have a different interpretation of that goal and a different way of how they want to solve that. But I think it takes a good leader to identify the best course of action that can move the group forward.
Okay. So on the one hand, obviously, even when it looks like you have a shared interest, right? Let's take yesterday's simulation, for example. On the one hand, I think we can probably all agree, and I don't want to get too controversial here, that we all have an interest in avoiding annihilation. Anybody want? Okay, good. I'm glad we have that on the table. So we're all realize that we have this interest in avoiding annihilation through the use of weapons of mass destruction, right? What gets in the way of that? What gets in the way? You said multiple interests. Let's unpack that a little bit. What gets in the way of that shared goal, right? The other obvious one you can have on your mind right now is climate change. We're all sitting there going, yeah, that's a continent on fire. And yet, what's going on? What?
Right, as China, we are incredibly worried about sanctions, so economics definitely play a role when it comes to taking action and solving a specific issue.
So you had this other interest that was going on, that you wanted to achieve this collective outcome. Again, it wasn't that you didn't share the collective outcome. You got that. You had this other interest that was undercutting your ability or your interest in adopting a certain strategy. I saw another hand over here.
I guess there's game theory sort of trust issues where if everyone did one thing, it would be optimal for everyone, but there isn't the belief that other people would make sacrifices for the collective whole.
Okay. Yeah?
I mean, sometimes it just comes down to honor and clout, making decisions because you want to be better than everyone else, even if it's not necessarily like a logical move.
So on the one hand, so we've got a few different now explanations out here, right? And again, we're making the assumption. We are making the assumption here that everybody actually agrees on a shared goal, right? And again, we can even pick the easy ones. I would like not to die in wars through weapons of mass destruction. Okay, great. I'd like the climate not to be destroyed by unimpeded climate change. Cool. And I kind of think that in general, we should make sure that women and other minoritized groups are equal with others. Excellent. Wow. Okay, we've got that. But actually, even once you're there, how do we get to the actual policies, right? And we're beginning to talk about what actually impedes it. And I want you to keep connected to this because this also filters into why global challenges are so hard. Why it is leadership becomes essential, right? Why it is leadership becomes essential in getting to some of the answers to these global problems, okay? Now, some of the mechanisms we have impeding it, one of which you said there are issues of trust, right? There are issues of trust, right? At any moment, when you're negotiating things in international affairs, right, you're dealing with an issue with a problem that you might be uncertain about what other people are going to do, right? And that can undercut your ability to work with others, right? I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to ask you to indulge me of my incredible cheesy in-class exercise about trust and uncertainty in international affairs, okay? But you're in a room, you're locked in here with me. I can do what I want. And this is actually what I call, in my world politics class, this is kind of called an anarchy game. And the basic idea is these are the types of things that can happen when you are in international relations and you are all kind of separate political communities with your own interests, right? Even if you see a mutual goal. Now, I'm going to give you kind of the meta version. In other words, like there are no grades in Albright, so my type of incentive structure, which is all fake anyway, doesn't work. But so let me tell you what I actually do with my students, and some of you have been subjected to this horror before. Okay. What I ask my students to do is this. I tell them that they all have the opportunity to earn some extra participation credit. Right? And you can earn either 5 points of extra credit on your participation, or you can earn 3 points. Okay. Which one do you think you want off the bat? 5, thank you. Okay, so let's get the obvious fact on the table. So we all agree we have a mutual goal of 5 extra points, correct? Okay, great. So let's complicate this. All I'm going to ask you to do to get 5 extra credit points is to hold up the number 1, okay? If you want 3, you would hold up 2. Okay? Still straightforward. You're like, yeah, I think we've got this negotiation exercise down. Here's the trick that gets thrown in there. I tell my students that if you hold up 1 and other people in the class hold up 2, the people who hold up 2 still get 3 points. Okay? So the people who hold up 2, they get 3 points no matter what. And if you hold up 1 under that scenario, you get nothing. You get nothing. Do you want to try? Well, let's do it. Okay. Let's close your eyes. Okay. Count of 3, you're going to hold up your hands with either a 1 or a 2. 1, 2, 3. Hold up your hands. Okay. Open your eyes and look around the room. Okay. Mikiko. Is something going on? Is there something, are you angry?
Me too.
What happened? What'd you make it? So let's see the hands again. Now, one thing I want to say immediately about this, for those of you, especially if you do econ, this is a game that's called the Stack Hunt, and I want to make something absolutely clear. This is what's called a multiple equilibria game. Both 1 and 2 are actually rational decisions. So the last thing I want you to think at this point is that if you picked 1 or you picked 2, that you did something wrong or right? And the answer to that is whether or not this is a rational move depends on what you think is going to happen with other people, right? So there is absolutely no wrong decision that has been made here. But you clearly worked through, and you did it very quickly, you worked through different processes, right? So what was your process to come back?
Well, so it's like if you hold up 2, right, you get 3 points no matter what. And even though if you hold up 1, it might be good in isolation. Like that was more risky, right? So like it would be better theoretically for you to get what you want, even if other people might not get it.
Right. So to begin with, here's something that happens when people feel uncertain and they lack trust and they have to worry about risk, right? What am I risking here, right? Now, and you can imagine, obviously, we're doing this at the level of a completely, meta game with actually no real outcomes to it whatsoever. But think about, for example, what you did yesterday. And you're actually talking about nuclear weapons, right? Are you willing to enter into agreements that allow you to denuclearize? Right? What's North Korea thinking about at that point? Maybe thinking, you know what? We're also looking around. We don't think that's worth the risk, right? So those types of trade-offs have to come in, right? Other 2s that I saw, and then I will get to the ones. Yeah, why did you make the decision you did?
I thought that everybody else would hold up at 2 so that we'd all get 3 points regardless.
And was it that because of, again, that kind of risk adverseness under uncertainty type of question, or?
I thought everybody would have thought it out that we all collectively would have gotten 3 instead of 5.
Okay. Well, let's talk about 1s. Who held up 1s here? Yeah.
Well, I held up a 1 because I also calculated first the risk that this wasn't for extra credit.
you basically, you blew my game up. You said there is nothing to value here that I need to achieve, so why would I do this?
So why would people choose 2 in that case if there's no risk?
Well, I think in some places, again, these are talking about different interpretations of the game. I think that other people held up 2 and said, well, I actually decided to go ahead and buy into the story that this is meaningful, right? But I think what you're saying is like, maybe if you'd given me something that I really valued, I'd be a little more risk adverse.
Well, I mean, all that we're valuing is hypothetical points, right? So if they're hypothetical, then we might as well aim for the highest point. And that's why I chose 1, because I figured that I could trust everyone. So I think at that point it's trusting that people are thinking the way that you're thinking about it.
Oh, well, that's a new thing, right? So think about the mechanisms that we're putting on the table that inhibit the ability to reach consensus on issues in global affairs, right? We have rationalist, what we call rational mechanisms, cost and benefit, right? I might have different interests. I have different risk acceptance, right? I treat uncertainty in different ways, right? To bring back Lauren's comment from earlier, there might be issues of prestige. Clout, you don't have to share this with me, but maybe some of you are like, you know what? I wouldn't mind being a 3 in a world of zeros. There are people who think like that. I'm not asking anybody to reveal themselves, right? There are issues, and I really like this, about what and how you perceive how other people are thinking in international relations, right? How people are thinking and feeling in international relations, how they formulate their own interests. That's good.
I just feel like everything comes down to like your own personal interests. The reason why I chose 2 is because I was thinking that I was really good in the class and I only need 3 points to get an A. So I didn't care about anything else, but I care about myself.
This is always the moment that, by the way, that I love when I'm teaching world politics, is that we do get all of these explanations out, right? Some of them are very, I'm just being defensive. It's not you, it's me. I was uncertain and I had to protect myself. And then we get some that's like, look, I have interests. My interest is to get an A. I am going to actually make the choice that advances those interests, right?
And I think like in politics it's the same.
Absolutely.
Like when you mention interest, that makes me think about when people approach us because we were the US, everyone has their own interest. Like, so for example, Dominican Republic approached me and they're like, we don't want to like break our like partnership with you because you're one of our bigger donors. So before they make a decision, their interests come first. And so they knew that if they break like ties with us, it wouldn't be beneficial. So similarly here, I just needed 3 points.
That's all I needed, and you were going to ensure that you got it no matter what anybody else in the class did. Yeah.
I chose one because I felt like this was the Albright Institute, and there's a reason why we're all here, right? So I felt like people would be willing to take the risk to get the higher reward because, you know, Albright, that attitude, and I was really shocked that
I was too.
people.
Go for it.
Yeah, just to go off of that, Evie, I think we were sharing in that energy. I just was closing my eyes and like imagining us with all ones and like smiling and cheering. We all got fives, you know. I think I was just thinking that everybody had the faith, or we had the faith in each other to just agree.
So I want to take a few more comments, but I actually really want to build off this as well, right? Because in some ways, it is disappointing, right? It is disappointing in that moment. It's like, wait a second, collective mobilization isn't simply going to happen, right? Consensus isn't just going to be built, even if it is, you know, equality and please don't let me die in a nuclear war and stop the planet being on fire. Like it. As somebody who does international relations, I'll be honest, like it can be depressing every day, right? How do you get through that, right? And in some ways to also realize, and again, I want to bring the other comments in here. Well, actually, I want to leave that as an open question. How do you get through it? Because that's part of it, right? You don't have to answer this question. I want to get comments from the room.
I kind of thought of 5 as kind of the shiny goal, like the perfect world where we all like end up and where we want to be. But it makes me nervous to just like step into that. When I think of like bigger pictures and other scenarios, like yesterday, like yes, I would love global denuclearization. Would that ever happen? Like maybe the baby steps have to happen first.
And again, I want to point this out. We want to talk about what it is. What is it that made you unwilling to kind of step into that? Like you said, okay, 5 is the goal. That's what we want. What made you unwilling?
I think when I think of other global issues, I think when people jump straight into 5, there's a lot of backlash, and we end up further back than we anticipated. Mm-hmm. It's like not everyone is always going to be on the same page as the 5, but we can all hopefully get people on the same page for 3. And then work towards 5.
Okay. So now this gets into the question of the value of compromising and building those kind of small steps towards change. Yeah. I'm going to start working this way, by the way. So people over here don't. I'm not going to leave you. I promise. Yeah.
That's fine. I chose 1, and I thought that it would be in everyone's interest to also get 5 points. For me, like it doesn't make sense why you would reach for the higher goal and like trust that everyone else would also do the same thing, so that we all would benefit and wouldn't have any losers. Mm-hmm. But I don't think people think that way. I mean, I know people don't think that way, but it's just the way I think. And I think that's the real problem, and if we're talking about international affairs and global affairs, that people don't have other people's interests in mind, only have their interests in mind, but in the end that's not beneficial for them either. If we're talking about climate change, having your own interest in mind in terms of developing your economy through using outdated resources that aren't going to be around for a long time isn't good for you either, because the planet's going to be destroyed and you won't be, like your country will not survive because you were able to develop faster. So I think that not thinking, I think a lot of people don't think long term in terms of having being mutually beneficial is also good for you, even in your own interests.
Right, right. Yeah. So then the question I'm going to have for you, and not just to be clear today, but throughout this entire institute, and if we can do our jobs maybe throughout your whole life, is what do you do about that, right? Because on the one hand, you can say, come on, it's climate change. Like, this isn't going to work out well if you don't address it and reach for 5. This is equality. Like, you have to do it for moral and practical reasons. These are nuclear weapons. Global zero is the only thing that makes sense. What's the reaction? What do you do when you then say, but there are other interests that begin to draw people away? There are balancing, and let's not even just say, like, is it obvious? Is it obvious? Right? You're a leader that on the one hand understands, let's just take the subset of people who understand that climate change is going to destroy the planet, right? But at the same time, you have short-term development goals that you need to reach, or your maternal mortality rate is going to skyrocket, right? And people aren't going to be able to eat, right? So you're the one who's balancing that, right? How do you get through that? How do you create a world in which people are able to transcend, to work through those short-term and conflicting material interests in order to get to 5, right? So the one thing I don't want you to do through this exercise is to think that, like, you know, your faculty director is some sort of nihilist that's trying to say, I'm sorry, you can't get there. Because I actually think that we have to work to get there, right? I'm deeply committed to that. So then the question becomes how. And I want to take a few more of your comments and then move on. You had your hand up again.
I did. I think someone said something about people choosing fives may be looked at in a certain way. I can't remember my point, but I was just saying thinking how I didn't understand why people who would aim for fives would get judged or looked at in a certain way when we all could have that opportunity and share that together.
And again, I think it's thinking about what are those cross pressures on that, right? So trying to both say we can have this together, but still trying to do that in uncertainty. And still trying to do that when you say, you know, I also have a short-term interest in this class and a short-term interest with a political community that I'm in charge of. Because remember, we're also doing this as individuals. Most of the time, people are doing this as people who are also responsible for entire political communities, right? And their well-being. Right? So they're trying to trade off, not just like, what do I get for myself versus what do we get as a collective, but what do I get for this nation, for this political community to whom I am responsible for? And can I do that at the same time, reaching these collective interests? Go with it. I'm going to start going this way because I feel like I've neglected this part of the room.
It's going to be a little confession. I was actually slightly distracted when you were explaining the rules, and I wasn't sure what was. But I think it tells something about the everyday people and the leadership, because I don't believe when everyday people are making decisions only on the rational basis. Let's say, yes, the climate is going to be destroyed, but some people are just like, I'm not going to leave by 2100. Why do I care? And I think when we talk about leadership, it's also really important for a leader or a collective movement to make sure that making people that don't care as much or are not as involved in things. And I think, or just even not being as well informed to be involved in something like me being distracted during this game. It happens, and it actually happens more often than we think, maybe.
Of course it always happens, because, you know, at the same time we're thinking about climate change and global nuclear zero and equality for all, we're also living our lives, right? We're also attempting just to function as human beings. So get out of bed, get ourselves breakfast. For me, get the kids off to school. By that point, I'm like, now I'm going to go think about big things. So part of this, and this is one thing I want to point out, is we, at the beginning of our discussion, we started out with the discussion of what leadership is, right, and why it's important. And then we kind of segmented into the nature of global issues, right? But I want you to, again, to begin to now merge these, because this goes back to what you said. What is leadership? It's mobilization, right? It's mobilization to affect change. So again, what I don't want you to walk away from is, again, thinking that's global issues, it's all self-interested, you know, nasty British short is your life, and that is the way it's going to be. It's how do you, if you see something out there where you need to get to 5, how do you mobilize the resources, symbolic, material, in order to affect change, right? And to be clear, there's not one way, but recognizing that as the fundamental problem is ultimately why we're here. Kenza, and then I'll come back.
I think to answer your question about how, we should talk about communication, because it's also about how you stated your question, the semantics of the question, and also about the fact that we didn't have time to consult. And so, in general, people don't take nuclear decisions just by saying, okay, close your eyes. We're going to
Well, clearly you're unfamiliar with the United Nations Convention. It's sorry.
I mean, maybe we won't reach that stage. But just being sure that we're, communication is an important factor as well.
So this is, and in some ways I feel like I'm giving away the punchline that's coming later, right? And in terms of the platform for action, right? Which is then, if this is the issue, why is it, how it is that you begin to do this through kind of global institutions and global negotiations, right? Because you're absolutely right. I didn't allow you to communicate. I didn't allow you to look at each other, right? And I gave you a few seconds to do this, right? Was that unfair? Yes, but it's also supposed to be representative of some ways of what it means to be in isolated political communities where you don't have access to communication, right? Where you don't have the opportunity to think about, to your point, how it is other people might be approaching the problem, or the political communities might be approaching the problem, right? Where you don't have any mechanism, material, symbolic or otherwise, to get people to commit to a course of action, right? So this is laying the groundwork. If this is the problem, again, the point is not to say, well, sorry guys, we can't do anything and it's been nice knowing you. It's to say, how do we begin to do this as a community, right? And you're right, this is the type of thing, and again, when I do this in my classes, I will oftentimes do this game in different classes over and over again so people can see how shifting the mechanisms, how shifting the space, how shifting the way we talk about each other might create different outcomes, right? Yeah, sorry.
So I'm not sure if this relates to like the global context of communication, but I picked one because when I thought about your question, I didn't think about it as a risk. I thought about it as a gain, because you weren't taking away points, you were adding them. And so in my brain, I would, if I'm going to gain something, I would rather have 5 points. And then if I don't gain something, I'm back where I started rather than you would be. I feel like if you had said, I will take away 3 points or take away 5 points, I would have approached it very differently. Oh my gosh.
Sorry, this is one thing. I actually have to do this moment, like, don't go down this road. You know, this stuff is too much fun to talk about. There's actually, by the way, a whole literature on people reacting more to gains, differently to gains and losses. Right, and that people are actually more willing to forego and to be riskier in gains. But it's like, if I frame it as a loss, you will like, even a pretend loss, you will like hold on to it as though like your life depends on it, and for minor stakes. So you're absolutely, the framing, that's a really good point, the framing changes. Sandra?
Related to that, so for me, I was, I chose one, I raised my hand for one, and that was because I was measuring my happiness level. So if I get a 5, I will be so happy. If I get a 3, not so happy. So I either go all in or go home.
So this is what, and I want to move on to this, then the question of leadership, and then actually to the kind of the substance of the theme, so you have that background. But I want you to really pay attention to what people are saying here. We're hearing difference of interests, right, as the way in which people made their decision, right? It can be short-term and long-term, it can be collective versus individual, but we're hearing about these different of interests. We're hearing about difference of values, right? What do I value? What did I think it gave me happiness? See, your points of extra credit on contribution, that made no sense to me, right? But we're hearing different interpretations and wanting to know about other people's interpretations, right? We're hearing differences about people's comfort with uncertainty and risk, right? As causing them to make different decisions about strategies, right? All of these things are playing into a moment that even if we understand that there is this incredibly important collective good out here, this consensus good, it makes it really, really difficult to achieve cooperation in a vacuum, right? Something, we can't just get into a room with our individual interests, right? And boom, consensus, we're happy, right? And this is what creates space to think about leadership, right? To think about how it is then that you mobilize all of these different interests and values and concerns and positions in order to affect change, right? In order to affect change, right? And I think that you can look at this in some ways. You can look at this as an exercise of, kind of pessimism, like how do you actually even do it, right? All of these interests, or you could look at this as an exercise of we can do it, right? We have seen examples of this being done in climate, in equality, in arms control. There have been momentous achievements, right? But we need to be thoughtful about how they were done and to understand that was certainly not a moment, well, luckily everybody agreed, right? Instead, we want to think about how it was that people came together and in particular were able to exercise leadership and mobilize the capacity to affect change. And one thing that I want you to understand throughout this institute, and I'll return to this a bit of the substance, is the ways in which people do this vary tremendously, Right? And I don't want to repeat a lot of the things that we were talking about yesterday. I know you went through with the leadership strengths, right? But I actually kind of want to incorporate this and kind of actualize and make it more concrete through this discussion, right? Because now you all know whether or not, you know, you're learners or achievers or relational and all of these things. But I would actually say that this actually comes down to real life strategies, right? That are not simply positional, right? Maybe you're the person that you can actually affect change in the scenario. If I were to do this game again, say like, you know what, I'm going to be relational. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go talk. I realize part of this is about uncertainty and individual trust. So I'm going to go out there and I'm going to build relationships. Or maybe you're somebody that's like, you know what, my strength is to be able to mobilize for change by giving some background information, or maybe I can actually think of the institutional mechanism that allows us all to commit to this in the future, right? You're all going to have different approaches, but all of them are ways that are necessary to affect change, right? And this is the final reason, the final principle I want you to keep in mind, and again, this is going to be so hammered home, I don't want to spend too much time on it, and I definitely want to make sure I give you some background to what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks, some substantive background, is the importance not only of these different styles of leadership, but your interdisciplinary expertise. We cannot know and do everything, obviously, right? And in order to be able to figure out the mechanisms that are going to work, the things that allow you to achieve the 5, right? You need to be able to figure out who you're actually going to need in the room on these issues, right? As somebody who teaches and writes, for example, on some issues of nuclear politics, I understand where my disciplinary strengths are, like, I've done a lot of the actual politics of nuclear negotiations. I understand a lot of the strategies and how people think and leaders think about using nuclear weapons. You know what I'm not? I'm not a physicist. And I'm not a chemist, right? So if I have questions, for example, of, gosh, is that arms control regime, monitoring regime going to work? Because it actually depends on being able to monitor the amount of radioactive material near the site. I don't do it myself. I call my friends, my colleagues who actually engage in that, right? So to also think about how you're going to have that type of knowledge as it comes into these particular issues. Okay. Now, in terms of the substance of the theme itself, I've given you kind of the broad architecture of like what it is we're going to look through this, right? In some ways, we look at an issue like equality, right? Which is ultimately what this is about. We're looking at this through the particular issue of, as it was conceived of in 1995, women's equality and gender equality, right? But I think in general, what you'll find is this became a platform to talk about equality more generally. Gender equality and equality of other minoritized groups in global affairs, right? And again, it seems like, on the outset, something that we can all agree on, right? But we know we don't. Right. Immediately when I put this out there, what do you think might be some of the issues that became stumbling blocks even as every single delegate to this conference, intergovernmental or governmental, believed they were committed to equality? Because I promise you, they were. Right? Nobody was sitting there over there going, yes, hi, I am the evil person who's going to undermine equality. That's why I'm here. I don't really agree with it, but I'm really enjoying my time in Beijing, right? So what are the stopping points? What are the moments that you see these different interests and values? If I were just kind of throw it out, what would you guess?
So the first thing that comes to mind is like people's specific definitions of equality. Mm-hmm. So what someone might want or see as being equal, someone might see as not equal, or someone might see as taking something too far, and that leads into like age differences and cultural differences and tradition and stuff like that.
The very definition of equality, right? What does it mean to pursue equality in international relations at a global level? How do you define that? Right? I spent a lot of time trying to read background statements leading up to this conference before I talked to you today. And one of the background statements that I read were discussions of equality and definitions of women equality that were released by delegations, as I mentioned this earlier, that were representing the Holy See. right? So basically representatives of the Catholic Church and the Vatican. And they were representing groups that said, you're talking about equality, but you're talking about this in this very specific way, as though women should have exactly the same rights as men. We see nothing in this language, for example, about the value of family, about the importance of valuing motherhood, about the importance of valuing and I will put my cards on the table. I sit there and go, well, I've got a different definition of this, but at the same time, there's a definition of equality that is different, right? And again, I think that looking at this is like, well, you're just here to undermine equality with your definitions of equality. That's not useful, right? We have to think about how those different definitions come into play and whether or not there's still productive space there to work on pursuing consensus. Okay, so even, sorry, you went for the big one, like equality itself. Like you put that out there like it's obvious, you're like, yeah, not so much. Other issues you can imagine being really difficult. Nina?
Sovereignty, when it comes to like with different definitions, when it comes to like one country, I guess, posing the one definition over.
Absolutely. Okay, and this is something, again, spoiling this. I love it when I feel like people are anticipating what was going to be at the end of the lecture, which is that there is a conception here, and they're battling conceptions over what is a universal, and are there universal rights and understandings of what those rights are, or do different political and cultural communities have their own right to define equality and rights, right? And is an attempt to impose a universal definition a violation of sovereignty in that political community, right? I want to say I do not think this should be an easy answer for anyone, right? Because on the one hand, there's something that is very, very important to understand, that we all have different definitions of rights, right? On the other hand, I am sure that I could put a list of things on the board that you would say, but that has to be universal. We have to protect people on that. That is not negotiable, right? But understanding that that is a fundamental trade-off when we're talking about something like global rights, right? Are we willing, and under what conditions, to say, this is universal, we are all going to commit to it, and how much space are we going to leave for sovereign political communities? Okay. Other issues, I think I saw your hand up.
Language and translation barriers.
How so?
Well, different languages probably have different structures for how to talk about these kinds
Right.
of things and different vocabularies.
Yes, so different vocabularies for thinking about rights, different ways you want them to be incorporated in. I would also put the example of different histories and what we call resonances, right? Which is not so much to say, even if you think you have the same vocabulary, they resonate in different ways. And I will take this moment to offer a really, really, really small anecdote on this, on the most shocking thing I ever had to do in a negotiation, which was that I was actually, so I was a lowly intern at the U.S. Embassy in Dublin, Ireland during this conference, but I was asked as a lowly intern to go and negotiate part of this platform with the EU, which basically should tell you not anything awesome about me, but what the actual political appointee thought about the importance of this conference. Let's let the 21-year-old do this, okay. But one of the things I got in the portfolio is like, well, there's this language there on not harvesting the organs of children and selling them. We need you to get that out of the platform. And I'm like, wait, what? Because I feel pretty strongly like this should be in. And it turns out this is about resonance. They said, no, this is actually this is a mobilization narrative of a conspiracy theory during the Cold War. We don't want it in there because it's a conspiracy theory during the Cold War. I had no idea, right? And I realized that part of my job, and the only way I could do this effectively, was to sit down with the EU my counterparts and say, this is what's going on, right? And have them understand that this is what had been lost in translation, right? This was the different resonance. Because other than that, I was in a really difficult position. And that's good. Go ahead.
You mentioned language, and I was thinking, since you mentioned there's not a universal law about equality, I was thinking about religion's beliefs.
Absolutely.
Are completely different from here to the west. From the west to the north.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, it's this balance between, on the one hand, There are going to be religious beliefs across all that actually are in contradiction with some of the things that are being put down as universal rights. So what do you do with that, right? What are you willing to compromise, right? What needs to be recognized?
I was thinking, even if we agree on definitions and like goals, the actual steps of achieving those goals, I think, will be in deep contention.
Yes, yes. So even if you get to the strategy, you know, that the goal, the thing you want, then you have to talk about how you do it, right? And I'll walk through this in a few moments because, you know, the kind of spoiler alert, there was a platform of action. It was voted on by 189 countries. It was, you know, approved by the General Assembly, and that did what? Absolutely nothing. Nothing. It's not international law. It's not a treaty. It's not ratified domestic governments. It's a statement, right? It's a statement. So what does it do, right? And then the question becomes, what were the strategies? How you actually got action on these key issues. Okay. Now I actually want to turn to the key issues, both so you have an idea of what they are, because they really inform the speakers that we selected to come in and talk to you over the next couple of weeks. I'm not, by the way, going to go through every single speaker because you have a schedule and Google and read, but you know, things like that. But I do want to put this into a bit of context. One slide that is out of place because I skipped over it, but I do want to show you this. To give you an idea of the 1995 conference, I want to show so that there's the UN conference in Beijing, and then there's the NGO conference. And as I said, that was done really, really purposefully. This actually gets to, Nina, you made the comment about concerns about sovereignty and rights. So China had agreed to host this conference, and one of the things, though, that some of China's leaders began to realize is that some of the discussions, and particularly some of the discussions that were going on in the NGO, were something that they considered to be problematic in terms of China's own sovereignty on issues of human rights. And one of the ways that this was addressed was to make sure the NGO conference was kind of as far off-site as possible. Now, it turns out, and actually you'll be meeting one of the delegates here soon, Susan Bailey. There were a lot of efforts, and ultimately the NGOs were very successful in getting to the other conference, but they were actually quite separate. What were some of the issues that were discussed? Now, what I'm going to do here is not only show you the issues that were discussed, but kind of give you an idea of, you know, then and now, 1995 to 2020. The platform for action ended up being a series of resolutions that were organized around 12 different platforms. Okay. Women in poverty. As you can see, these are just kind of snapshots. Women and girls are enrolled around 4% more likely than men and boys to live in extreme poverty, and the risk rises to 25% for women ages 25 to 34. Women in education. Between 1990 and 2010, the proportion of people living in developing regions living at the threshold of $1.25 a day fell from 47% to 22%. Oh, that was under poverty, my apologies. Women in health, right? Good news and bad news. Women's life expectancy has increased, and women's maternal mortality has also decreased. But there are still significant inequities, particularly in rural and developing regions, for women in access to health care, and particularly to reproductive and natal health care. Women in violence. We know that women are subjected more to violence than men. Some statistics show that 37% of women across the globe will be subjected to violence against their person at some point in their life, and most of that violence is domestic. Most of that violence happens to a woman from somebody that she knows and is in a relationship with. Women in armed conflict. The stats here, and again, I just kind of pulled out selective stories. These are not meant to be over-encompassing here. Women are oftentimes adversely affected through armed conflict. They're more likely, for example, to be refugees. Violence against women increases. And yet women do not often have a political say in these armed conflicts. They are left out of parliamentary decisions. They are left out of the negotiating table during peace negotiations, right? Even as they are subject more to the harm of these negotiations. Women in the economy. I'm not going to say much here because we have a whole day devoted to women in the economy and women in work, right? But again, focusing here on the idea of how to empower women who are a vital part of the labor market. They are oftentimes, however, in jobs that are lesser paying than the ones that men occupy. They are doing domestic labor that is often unpaid and unrecognized. Right? So how do we think about women and recognizing and valuing their place in the economy? Women in power and decision making. The lack of women representative in political institutions, parliaments, executive branches, ambassadors. In all of these areas, women are underrepresented in proportion to the representation in the population. Women and institutional mechanisms. This gets to almost the how, right? Women are out of power, they're not integrated into the economy or supporting the economy, and there seems, moreover, to be a lack of institutional mechanisms to help support them, right? By this mean anything from the devotion of financial resources to one of my favorite kind of indicators of this is that we, and for those of you who are coming from mathematics field, we don't even have the data to know what we're supposed to do. Because across key metrics of politics and economics, only 26% of those have any gender component data. So we don't even know what women are doing and how to help them. You can't start devoting financial resources unless you know what the problem is. And we don't even know what the problem is because of the lack of institutional resources. The human rights of women. Property law. Family law. In many places, these are undeniably biased against women, giving them unequal access to the very types of resources they need to build an equal life. Women in the media, both in terms of women being underrepresented in the media, just go ahead, pull out your daily op-ed page, you'll see what I mean, right? As well as the way in which women are consistently portrayed in the media. Women in the environment. Because women oftentimes rely on land and agriculture's resources, because they have limited mobility, they are more likely to be impacted by climate change and other environmental disasters. And the final area here, the girl child, the very specific focus on how it is we address the role of girls in communities in order to create gender equity over time. Okay. These slides will be up. I don't expect you to memorize them, but these are the focal points of the Beijing conference and the platform for action, right? And what we'll be discussing now over the next few weeks is kind of unpacking each of these. All of the speakers in some way or another actually address one of these topics and how it is that you can actually affect change. Yeah.
This data, we're gonna the speakers, or are we gonna talk about then and now? And who is it included in the data?
So sorry, who is included in the data?
Yeah, what?
What types of definitions actually drive the collection of data themselves?
Because a lot has changed since 1995, but I also want to know if which populations are going to be counted in the data, only upper class, middle class.
This is a really good point.
Or transgender women will be included in the data. I just want to know.
So it's going to be, so on all these points, you should ask the individual speakers if they come in with data. That's actually one of the questions you ask. What is your data? Where does it come from? You'll find especially that there are speakers that come in and they've collected data themselves, so they're going to be very thoughtful for it. The answer to your question is in many ways it's shifted over time, and again, it depends on the organization that's gathering the data. So for example, the EU has undergone a lot of changes in how they collect data, very purposely recognizing, for example, transgender people who identify as transgender in their data collection. UN has done this, other organizations not so much, right? So it has absolutely changed over time. So these are the topics that inform this next few weeks. And the questions that I want you to bring about this is, how is it that kind of creating this type of platform and recognizing these issues creates space for global change? Right? How does it actually affect our understanding as a global community about equality? How can we create the mechanisms to mobilize, whether or not it's national governments, international institutions, civil society, behind this type of platform? So let me just kind of end with kind of a final thing on what this means in terms of affecting change, right? One of the things that I actually said in terms of this is you get this platform, right? It's organized around these 12 things, but ultimately, as I said, it affects nothing, right? It itself is not a piece of international law. It's not a treaty that anybody commits to, right? And there's a decent amount even of resistance into how all this is defined, okay? So how do you think, or do you think, what do you think is the value of having a platform that draws attention to these issues? That's assigned by and committed to by 189 states, even though in a completely non-binding way. What do you think is some of the importance there? Yeah.
It's at least public and official, so there's a record to it that somebody like now we can look back and see what people have at least said that they would commit to.
Okay. But why does that commitment matter? I mean, technically, it's a commitment that you can walk away. Yeah.
I think that the publicization of it is important in so much as in some communities, even the recognition of it has been highly debated or politicized. So I think that even recognizing it gives a lot of power to individuals, even if there's not something that's acted upon. I think that it does give a certain amount of steps.
So I'm going to tie this into Sandra's great opening definition of leadership, right, and mobilization, right? By making it public, it actually creates some mechanisms for mobilization, one of which is oftentimes something that's called, in the International Institutional Committee, the ability to name and shame, right? It gave to civil society groups the capacity to turn to some of their home governments and say, you made a commitment. You made a commitment, for example, to the political equality of women, right? So we're now going to bring to you the idea that we should have in our national law a quota system. Right? A quota system, for example, for representation of women in parliament. Something that both, for example, Rwanda and Uganda adopted after the Beijing conference, right? And people argue is directly tied, not because they looked and said, well, we're now compelled, but because they suddenly had a lot of civil society groups saying, so you signed something, and we would like to see you actually enact that into commitment. So it becomes a mobilizing device through naming and shaming. I saw a hand over here.
Such platform can create also competition between countries because they know what's going well and wrong, like all around, and so it can bring ideas to have different programs or try to improve things, and then create a conversation inside each country.
Right. So I like that. Tell me a bit about this more about competition.
I mean, we're like in a very capitalistic world, so that the economy is everything, and so unfortunately, I don't want to say it, but it's reality. And so having this idea of being better than the other, and like having also like social advantages, and like having like taking into account the environment and social welfare is also very important for the image of the country, and so it wouldn't be that good to appear in front of all the countries and say, hey, like, women don't have any rights in my country.
So it basically becomes, there becomes almost a competition along two ways. First of all, recognizing and mainstreaming the idea that there are material benefits, right? That if you aren't actually investing in women, you're not investing in your economy, for example. But there also become kind of prestige points. Right? Who is actually making headway? Who's making the most headway, right? One thing, and I was thinking about this when you asked your question, and that's good, there are actually benchmarking exercises, for example, of where states are on particular issues of rights, right? And to be clear, things have changed in the last few years, right? But there was a sense of you didn't want to be last on the benchmarking for being progressive on issues of equality, right? Whether or not that meant how you were gathering your data, what types of laws you were enacting, right? This was out there for people to be able to see. Yes.
One thing I would add is that we talked yesterday a lot about the back channels that were so important in Abkhazia. Tens of thousands of people were in Beijing for this conference. There was what happened at the official level, but also deeply important and lasting relationships were formed between representatives of states, representatives of NGOs that endured in really important ways and formed the basis of global advocacy for women for decades to come. And I've heard many women who were at that conference talk about those relationships across the global north and south, across the NGO and government lines, becoming the foundation of a lot of back channel work that has become really important to advancing these platforms beyond what was defined at the global level.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you want to think about this, if what we're doing here is we've talked about what the problems are, right? We talked about how to identify. Now the question is, how is it that this is used in order to lead people towards change, to increase equality, right? We have these different mechanisms. We have ones about naming and shaming, right? We have ones about changing actual material and symbolic incentives, right? Here's some nice carrots, change your behavior and we'll get you I'll give you the nice carrots. We have this idea of creating networks that create new pathways of mobilization, right? These sites that were previously disconnected began to realize that they had shared interests and could actually coordinate and move together as a community, right? Other pathways, yeah.
The creation of like a common language for what these things mean.
Absolutely. And actually, this is really important to put out, a common language, part of which you're going to hear in the next panel, where you're going to have Lisa Muscatine, who is Hillary Clinton's speechwriter. A convergence around the language of human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. This is something that seems so obvious to us, the framing of it. It's a human rights issue. But it wasn't a human rights issue. Right? It was at this conference that you see, and people have actually documented this through textual analysis, an uptick in the combination of this is a woman's right and it is a human right. Right? Why is that important? Why is that sudden shared language important? Somebody noted yesterday all the semantic stuff. Why does it mean? Yeah.
It's the why should it matter to you, especially if you're not a woman. Maybe link those two things together.
That's right. It made women's equality a global issue that mattered to everyone, right? It's also important to realize that in terms of thinking about the United Nations, right, there's something incredibly fundamental about the role of human rights, right? Arguably, you don't get more important than the idea of preserving human rights. So this took this issue that was considered to be, it's niche, right? It's a little over to the side. I mean, you care about the big stuff, you know, like arms control. Right? Care about the economic development, the financial system. Well, that's nice. It said, no, this is a core issue of global affairs, right? And that was a turn, right? That was a change that actually happened in the language that was being used. And then it feeds into these other mechanisms, right? The moment you said that, what you were doing is saying, and now this needs to be a priority for you.
I think you should also mention visibility.
Oh, yeah.
I think it is really important, particularly in the Women in Gender Studies department. We study that a lot in terms of like how this being documented, and now with social media outlets and platforms, not only like one particular person bringing visibility to these communities, but like a lot of them doing so, it creates a change.
Right. And this kind of brings us to the place that I want to end, is this question of visibility. It's another way in which this actually affected change. I mentioned the platform itself was nothing. It's words on a page, right? But it gets embedded. It gets embedded into national laws, and it does begin to get embedded into international institutions and other forms of international law. And one thing, arguably, is that the visibility of this then made it so these other issues suddenly had to mainstream gender. So if you look at something, you know, so for example, in the 2000s, the Millennium Challenge Goals, and now Sustainable Development Goals, they have a gender component baked into it. It is not, we're going to talk about development and finance, and then maybe women. We're going to talk about this and realize that gender has to be in it, right? If you look at the latest conference on, many of you learned yesterday about the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. One of the groups that spearheaded that was one of the oldest women's movement groups in the world, ICAN, right? They're one of the groups that actually received the Nobel Prize for it. And they made the argument that understanding this through a gendered lens is essential to bringing the world to global zero, right? So this, because of that visibility, became part, not just something out here, but a core part of all of these issues in global affairs.
You said global zero a couple times. What is that?
Sorry. Global zero is basically a movement towards the elimination of all nuclear weapons, right? So yeah, global zero, denuclearization of the world, all of those are part of a piece. Thank you for the question of clarification. But yes, so all of this stuff is now not just simply over here, it's integrated into the very mainstream of what we talk about when we talk about global issues. Do one more question. I want to give you guys a little more of a break because we're going to a panel after this. You must be tired.
So this was like a while ago, and this was mainly by government organizations. I mean, also the NGO, which I think is very important.
Very important.
But if governments change and the whole like administration like believes and has different values and they represent different constituencies, how does that affect like previous work on this topic?
So this is this kind of gets to the final reason of why I thought it would be interesting to center our discussions around this year, right? Because you said what happens. Unfortunately, we seem to have a bit of a natural experiment going on right now. We can see what happens, right? Arguably, globally, there has been a backlash against movements towards equality, right? And one of the things, there are a lot of discussions about how it is, what do you do in year 25? With this, right? Do you have another intergovernmental conference? And there are actually many people who said, no, you don't, because you don't want, this is a very different time. There's a very different time in 2020 than it was in 1995, right? Seeing the rise of authoritarian governments that not only, it's not just simply that they're not committed to equality, right? But that actually part of their movements and moving against civil society is to move against gender equality organizations, or equality organizations more generally. That's a key strategy. Do you want those governments at the table, right? There are questions, perhaps a little more ambiguous. As I mentioned at the beginning, you mentioned the question of sovereignty, right? In 1995, there was a little more of a yay liberal international order, right? We love institutions. We love universal rules. Right? We are generally all committed towards liberal progress, and now there are a lot of questions about it, some of which we might not be comfortable with, some of which might actually be a little more resonant. To what extent, as I said earlier, can we impose, or do we want to bring everybody towards a singular vision of equality and rights? And to what extent do we have to understand the plurality of political and cultural communities that exist on this planet, right? And therefore, what is the approach? How do we address it then, right? But this isn't in any ways why I wanted to do this theme in this moment, right? On the one hand, I'll admit, it is a moment, I think, to kind of honor the secretary herself on the 10th anniversary and her role in this type of intergovernmental organization. But on the other hand, I also think it breaks open really key questions for us on issues of equality, but also issues on where we are at this moment of global governance, right? To what extent do we have faith in intergovernmental negotiations? To what extent do we want to commit to universal notions of human and women's rights and gender equality? And to what extent do we think that there's a movement towards more pluralistic understandings? And how do we proceed from that? So with that in mind, I'm going to let you all take a break. We have a panel coming up. Thank you so much for being so willing to have a conversation. And